Thank you so much for joining us from across the country and across the world. I'm Amanda Bograd. I'm the CMO here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc., and we so appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us today. As many of you know, Conscious Capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of capitalism and business. It is a movement of business leaders around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism to elevate humanity. And Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement. Every week, we're offering virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy is taking shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today, we are diving into a topic our speakers have spent the last 2 years researching: executive pay. I'm so excited to hear what Judy Samuelson and her team uncovered through their talks with boards, investors, scholars, and experts in governance and compensation. You can find their modern principles for executive pay in PDF form in a link in the chat box for reference throughout the talk. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Our speakers will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 15 minutes of our session. You can type any of those questions into the Q&A box at any time. If you have any technical questions, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org and we'll help you resolve those. So now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Judy Samuelson is the Executive Director of the Business and Society Program at the Aspen Institute and the author of a new book, The 6 New Rules of Business. And Miguel Pedrao is the Senior Program Manager of the Business and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. They will be interviewed by Michelle Green, President Emeritus and Board Member of the Long-Term Stock Exchange. Welcome, Judy, Miguel, and Michelle.
Nice to be here.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda.
I am very pleased to be here with Judy and Miguel because I am a huge fan of the Aspen Business and Society Program. And I'm going to talk about that more in a moment, but we're here today to talk about compensation. And I want to start by framing the problem. What are we actually trying to solve here when we talk about compensation? I work with the Long-Term Stock Exchange, and we spent years developing listing standards that are supposed to try and help businesses operate in more responsible ways. And the number one request that we got from investors when we were looking at what those changes should be was to look at compensation, executive compensation and board compensation. But what does that mean? We've been talking about this for a long time. And so what are we trying to solve? So I have the perfect person here today to answer that question, and that is Judy Samuelson. She's going to frame this problem for us because Judy, in addition to her day job running the Aspen Business and Society Program, is actually the author of a terrific new book. And I think the folks on this call would particularly benefit from reading it. So here's my shameless plug for Judy's book, The 6 New Rules of Business, which really is a wonderful description of how businesses should change in today's world to build real value and get at the types of value that the folks who are joining us here today, I think, understand and work for in their own companies. But what Judy does is she not only gives her theories, which are incredibly thoughtful, she also gives really telling examples. So it's storytelling as well, and really makes her suggestions come alive with these examples that she gives. And after explaining these 6 rules, which you'll have to read yourself, Judy has 2 final chapters that address some of the things that she sees getting in the way of making these necessary changes. And one of those chapters is actually about compensation. So Judy, can you frame for us why this is such an important issue? We've been talking about it for a really long time, but what are we really trying to solve, and why does it matter?
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the entire network for welcoming us in to talk about this issue. Miguel and I have worked on this together for years. We say 2 years just because if we told you how long we've actually been working on it, it would sound like we were working really slowly. And in some respects, we were, in that we were taking our time to try to unravel what feels like a problem that everybody feels ought to just be able to be simple to solve. There have been lots of attempts through regulations starting back in the 90s and since, to either through radical transparency, or empowering investors to have a say on pay. There have been various attempts to try to get a handle on it, and we've seen nothing but skyrocketing CEO pay. But that's not actually what brings us to the table, or what first brought us to the table. we've been concerned with pay for a number of years, and it came out of the work that we started doing on how do you really align the business with long-term thinking. And we thought that pay was an important piece of that. But we were, after the market meltdown in 2008, we were compelled to kind of go back in and say, what do we miss about this? You know, could we simply just say we'll make pay longer term, or was there something else at play here? And I think it actually brings us very back to the kind of purpose of the Conscious Capitalism Network, in that we believe in the Aspen Business and Society program, much like I think you all do, that we simply have deep respect for business institutions, and the capacity that they have to tackle our most complex problems. We will not address inequality. We will not really make the kind of moves we need to make on climate change without business fully at the table and engaged. And then that next piece, that it's the business that has the real agency here. You know, at the beginning of a new administration, we like to talk about regulation, and of course that is back on the table and is a healthy thing to kind of make sure we raise the bar. But we believe deeply that business, kind of left to its own devices, has a lot of the skills and the capacity to address these problems. And we simply need that kind of forward lift. And so then that takes us back to the executive. It's very much about the mindset of the CEO. And what we've started learning through the inquiries we did with directors and with critics of pay and people in the labor movement and a host of people in NGOs and in corporate governance and in law, we started to reveal a problem that essentially is as simple as what were we really paying executives to do? And I'll just end by saying what you begin to observe through, you know, takes us back to, in some respects, the question that the Business Roundtable opened up a year and a half ago, when it restated the purpose of the corporation. It essentially said business has to attend to a host of different inputs and be conscious of all of its outputs, and those who sit outside the company and those who, of course, labor within the company to good ends. And so that is a very complex endeavor. And if you put stock price at the center of pay, it's essentially negating that kind of intention of the Business Roundtable's powerful restatement of the purpose of the corporation. And when that started to reveal, that really led us onto a series of conversations in a new direction.
Thank you, Judy. Terrific framing. And I really do encourage you to read the book, because Judy has terrific statistics about how much this has influenced the way that companies act and the way that we see buybacks and other issues really playing into how companies behave in ways that compensation is an important component of. So I want to now turn to the work that Judy and Miguel have been doing with the Aspen Business and Society program. And the Aspen Business and Society program is one of my favorite places, just because they convene and do really actionable work on important, critical topics. They're not afraid to take on the tough topics. And pay and compensation is not an easy topic, though it's been talked about for a long time. There are not easy answers. And it can also be a difficult conversation to have when you have really all of the key stakeholders in the conversation in the room. But Miguel and Judy do not shy away from that. They welcome it. And so this process, as Judy mentioned, I was fortunate to be a part of it for 2 years, but I know that Judy and Miguel did a ton of work leading up to the working group that worked on it. So I'd like, Miguel, if you can just tell us a little bit about how did you come to this particular topic? Which folks did you decide to get involved and why? And how did you approach the work in order to come up with a set of actionable results?
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. And thanks everyone on the call. You know, Judy alluded to that it's been a bit of a long journey around exec comp for us. You know, 15 years ago, our program was really concerned about extending time horizons in executive pay. But 15 years ago, these days feels like a lifetime. And if you think about what the world was 15 years ago and what the business community was grappling with, the main topics of the time, it was very different. I mean, that was before the Obama presidency. It was before the global financial crisis. It was before the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Tea Party. That was really before social media dominated our lives. it was also right at the cusp of when millennials were entering the workforce in force and demanding more purpose from their employers and from the companies that they buy things from. So the entire ecosystem that business operates in is so different. And I think that's kind of what led us to revisit the topic of executive compensation, that the demands on business leaders are different, the job itself is different, and they're responding to just vastly different expectations, from policymakers, from the public, from investors, and so the framing of time horizon was insufficient. We needed to go deeper into more detail about all these other factors that were coming up. And so we started with a really long kind of review of academic literature, many conversations with investors, CEOs, directors, consultants, and other scholars. And I mean, I'm well over 100 conversations, often one-on-one with folks. And so these themes kind of emerged. And I don't know, Michelle, is now a good time for us to just actually show the
it is. Segue into my next question. What was the outcome? And I know I know we arrived at a principles-based approach. Can you talk a little bit about why that principles-based approach and then what the actual principles are? So this would be a great time for this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the principles-based approach is really an acknowledgement that this is incredibly complicated and incredibly context-specific. There really isn't any magic pixie dust that we can just drop on directors and have them all of a sudden just come up with the really well-designed, effective pay packages. It depends. There are so many variables, including the executive themselves and what motivates them, their own intrinsic motivation, the companies that they lead, the culture in those companies, the nature of that industry, and a whole host of other factors, the pressures that they face. And so we decided on the principles-based approach because we are not going to claim that we know how to design perfect pay packages ourselves. That's not our business, and frankly, no one does. But it's the board of directors' job to do their best around pay, and it's a really important one. And so what we wanted to do is lay out something that would be useful, a resource that could reshape conversations in the boardroom about executive pay. And so we landed on 5 principles. They're here. I won't read them for you, but I'll just say that they basically revolve, I think, around 4 core themes. One is just integrity. Judy used the word alignment earlier. It's basically, is pay tied? Does it reflect what you say you're about as a company? And right now, that is pretty demonstrably not the case. If a company says they're about some higher purpose, I guarantee you that their pay package is at least 80% weighted in stock or reflected or focused on stock performance. So there's an integrity issue there. There's fairness, and we want to redefine fairness in a more useful and comprehensive way, looking inside the firm instead of outside the firm. There has been a theory of fairness around exec pay for the past few decades, but fairness has been defined as, does my CEO make a little bit more than the CEO in their benchmark group at this tiny narrow slice of people? So we want to redefine that and look internally. And does this make sense for our company? Does it make sense following a logic that our employees would recognize their pay in? And probably not these days, right now. There's then simplicity was a huge theme that came in our research from investors in particular. Investors are sick of piling through 30-page disclosure statements about what an exec comp package is. It raises all kinds of red flags around gaming. It also suggests if a pay package is that complex, it's not likely to motivate anybody. So the theme of motivation gets removed from the table. And then what is the complexity for? So simplify pay packages, and then ultimately accountability. There's the chain of influencers that kind of touch executive pay packages and inform executive pay packages is long. And we wanted to emphasize that the board of the company still bears ultimate accountability for that. We can't shirk that responsibility and blame investors or blame proxy advisors or blame comp consultants for the outcomes of this, that the board really needs to take ownership of this and understand it within the context of that company's culture and business model.
Great. Now, let's keep those. Can we keep those up for a minute? Because I just want to warn our participants. Can we get that slide back? Because there will be a quiz on the principles. And so I want everyone to take, a good look at those because we're going to ask you which of these you think is most important and which of these you might disagree with or would change. So take a quick look at those, and then maybe we'll just take that quick poll right now once everyone's had a chance to take a look so that we can get your input. So let's keep it up for just another minute. So which do you think is most important, and which, if any, do you disagree with and or would change? And the poll's gonna pop up in just a moment so that everybody can answer that. And while folks are looking at that, Miguel and Judy, can you tell us a little bit, as you went through this, you talked about fairness, you talked about simplicity, you talked about accountability. These all seem like reasonable standards. Did you get pushback on any of these, or was it surprising to you kind of who fell into what camp as you worked on these principles?
There was a point at which we started working intensely with a team from Korn Ferry that is essentially leaders of their executive compensation practice, people who are steeped in these issues, have been working on them for decades. And I think being able to work with these practitioners gave us a lot more confidence that the ideas that had emerged out of our early years of dialogue had real resonance for people who were actually in the business of having to design and execute on pay packages. And they were seeing the same issues from the inside and became quite committed to the idea that if we could deliver a set of ideas rooted in principles and put the agency back into boards, that this in fact was maybe their most important responsibility as an enterprise, or it's certainly one that needed a lot more attention. It gave us kind of more wind in our sails. And so I wouldn't say there was ever a point at which we really went, we're way off track, or there was something. One interesting piece, clearly the principle around fairness is a very complex endeavor, and every company is different. Miguel made that point that, you can't, the design of pay simply has to be rooted in what that company is principally about and what they're trying to accomplish. But when you get to fairness, the system was so far out of whack, and everybody agreed was out of whack. But I think the one thing that we started to hear from some voices is you're never going to fix this problem from top down. You're not going to get CEOs to simply say, I'm going to redesign my own pay. We had to be more creative about that. And almost we started hearing from some voices, I wouldn't say it was like, everybody by any means, that you have to fix it from the bottom up. You're going to have to kind of create more opportunity at the bottom and level people up. The answer is we have to do both. There's no question, but we have to work at both ends of this system. But there has to be a fair relationship between the CEO and his or her direct reports, between the management team and the rest of the enterprise. And then lastly, that is where the board needs to step back and say, how much are we really going to send back to shareholders? And how much are we going to retain for investment in our workers and in our future? And that principle really, I think, that kind of definition of pay, we haven't had any pushback on that. That's resonated. That doesn't mean it'll be easy to implement, but it resonates.
Coming to that question for sure. Miguel, anything you'd add there?
So I think there wasn't pushback, but as you go through this process, the principle around simplicity gets complicated as well. And I think for the conscious capitalism community, particularly as well, because I'm sure this community is very well versed in kind of environmental, social, and governance type stuff. And our tendency still, even in the quote, I'll put myself in this kind of do-gooder category, is still to default to a kind of pay for performance logic. If we start attaching discrete incentives around, a whole bunch of very important social and environmental metrics, pay packages are going to get much more complex as well. The price will continue to go up on those pay packages. And so there's a really delicate and serious calibration that we need to think about. How do we keep packages simple and really enable an executive to focus on what's truly important And I would just suggest that one answer might be that we don't have to solve everything through a pay package. And that there, one solution here is, trusting that you hire the right executive who is intrinsically motivated on the things that matter to the company, and that that extra incentives on those things aren't going to improve their performance on this stuff. They're already motivated to do that. So I think the simplicity principle creates some tension, as we think about how to do this well.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important point, which I just want to put a pin in for a moment, which is this idea that aren't you hiring the people who are intrinsically motivated, and is pay really changing anything? Right. So I think that's a question definitely we should consider. I want to quickly turn to the poll, if we can, to the poll of the folks on the call, just to see what you think about the most important principle and which principles you disagree with and or would change. So if everyone can take a quick minute to give us their thoughts, that would be terrific. While folks are filling that out, Miguel and Judy, obviously you've encountered this in your work, just to that question about the intrinsic motivation. How do you answer that? Does pay change the analysis, or is it really about just hiring the right intrinsically motivated people, and pay is not how we actually motivate changes in behavior?
Miguel's much better at this part of it than I am, but let me just say that I think that there is some kind of a reckoning here that we're in a period of massive change. And one of the things that Korn Ferry and their work on leadership has been very clear on is that the job of the CEO has changed. You need to be hiring a CEO that understands that he or she is really leading a community, both internally and in some respects is as central to a much larger ecosystem of forces that influence the business, and the business is also influencing. And so you're not hiring for somebody who kind of has a single objective function kind of mindset. You need to be hiring for somebody who has kind of deep curiosity and listening skills, and has the ability and the desire and the intentions to really manage at this kind of complex domain in order to enable the business to do what it's equipped to do. And so I think that's a reset, and we're seeing some of that through some of the new hires that are coming into business. Miguel, your thoughts on the incentive piece?
Yeah, I I don't want to go too far. Personally, if it was over beers, I would probably go too far on this. So I'll try and
early in the day.
Try and stay moderate here. I think that the motivational power of executive pay packages is probably in some circles overstated or overassumed. I think and we heard this in various interviews with people and the like. Often, what's driving at least the total quantum of pay often is much more human than that, and sometimes it boils down to some very simple kind of social pressures amongst CEOs and who are friends with each other, and we see this in sports too. If you can think of an elite athlete who's under pressure from their own, in this case they have unions usually, but a great quarterback in the NFL, even if they are uncomfortable with being paid $30 million, will take that $30 million if for nothing else because they don't want to drive the price down for their fellow quarterbacks, right? And there's a similar dynamic there with executives, and so it's not all greed, and it's not all I think there's a lot of kind of blanket assumptions we can make, but I don't think the motivational impact of pay packages is terribly strong. I think these are highly motivated people to begin with, and what we risk is kind of distracting them from the things that they already are motivated with when we load up all these goals. Goals are really powerful to grab attention, but I don't think senior executives have a problem with effort. And incentives at their core are about increasing effort. that's not the problem that I don't think that we need to solve in the executive suite usually.
Right. Great.
I mean, there is a signaling device there, and that's where the instincts around, and we talk about this in Principle 1, which says that executive pay varies meaningfully with both financial results and non-financial drivers of long-term value. So there will be things that get introduced into pay that are absolutely critical. Shell has put carbon targets into their CEO's pay. Whether, what does it end up being? 10% of the kind of valuation or something. But it's still a signaling device that we're taking this very, very seriously, and we're going to make sure we embed it in. How many, to what Miguel's saying, how many of those different things you can put into a pay package without it just being confusing is a fair question.
Right, and that's where there's some tension, I think, between the principles or among them, right? Because simplicity, but tying it to goals, these may argue against each other in practical application. Right. Just quickly gonna share the results of the polls. Hopefully you all can see these now. Pay and unambiguous ties to the company's purpose and long-term success seems to be dominating the most important principle. And there's a real mix in terms of whether there are any that folks would change. Clear jargon-free language seemed to get some of the most votes on that, and that may be because of this idea that it isn't necessarily simple, and so there is tension among these, so that may be where that's coming from. I want to give you, Judy and Miguel, certainly if you want to reflect on what we just saw there on the poll, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I also want to talk a little bit about, and these may tie together, which is why I'm asking you the multiple question here, but why aren't we seeing this change, and what will it take to bring about meaningful change? And Judy, I know you give terrific examples in the book. Are there places that are doing it right, or at least doing it better, and what can we learn from those? So that's a whole series of questions, because I want to throw that out there for you to share what you think is most important in these last few minutes before we turn to audience questions.
We did a conversation about pay through the Business Society program in a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and our partner at Korn Ferry, Don Lohman, said at the end, it was kind of like, what the panelists were asked something along the lines of, what's the piece you would really focus on if you could here? Like, what's the signal you would send to boards? And he said, I think we may need to zero base this whole thing. In other words, have the conversation in the boardroom that essentially says, if there were no prescriptions already in play, if there was no precedent that we had to build on, if there were no comparisons being already engaged around either a peer group or these benchmarking systems that everybody criticizes and know that they're all driving up CEO pay to ridiculous extremes, what would it look like? And I think that's a really interesting thing to try to do in boards. I think to essentially say, all right, let's put aside for a second the ability, the need to deliver a pay package next month. Let's have this conversation. What are we designing pay to do? Like, what do we think that the health of the enterprise is dependent on? And what do we need the manager to be paying most attention to? Just to kind of strip it back and say, and what would it feel like if we were apportioning the rewards fairly across the enterprise? We're in the situation in the last decade where I think it's something like 90% of profits have been distributed to shareholders, retaining a very small percentage. And if you load in the amount of borrowing in order to engage in share buybacks, it goes up even higher. What are we paying executives to do? It's a fundamental question today. And so I think there's a moment here where we will see some experimentation, but it's going to take real courage. And our operating premise when we launched this work, we had learned from the Aspen principles, which among other things had recommended stop providing quarterly earnings guidance. And because of the board connectivity, the kind of interlocking boards, that idea got picked up in almost every boardroom. Not that everybody followed it eventually, and some of them were just continuing to do annual guidance that they would update every quarter. So I don't know what difference it made, but they had the conversation, like, why are we actually trying to guide the market? What's the purpose of that action? Is it helping or hurting in terms of building the kind of enterprise that we want to manage here. And so I think our assumption was that we would need to build some kind of a core group of businesses that were willing to experiment. They would give each other some confidence and make some change, and we would start to see some pickup through the interlocking connections that exist throughout public company boards. This is clearly a focus on public companies, but in the area of long-termism, nobody's against it.
Right.
When you start talking about pay, there in fact are different perspectives. And if there's anything we know from the experience of the say on pay votes, is that the shareholders are not going to stop and reflect on pay seriously. As long as the stock price is going up, they're going to vote yes. The say on pay has become a kind of a litmus test for whether or not they believe that the share price is right. And that's not so we're not going to get the kind of lift that one would think you could get from investors. They're all over the map in terms of how they would look at this and what they would think is most important. So I think it is back to boards. I think one of the things that Korn Ferry has been very clear on is you need real board engagement. This cannot just be delegated to the comp committee. You need the whole board sitting in as kind of in plenary to say what are the consequences of how we're paying now and how might we do things differently. And so we believe that we'll start to see a lot of change in boardrooms coming out of COVID. We'll start to see more people retiring, both in the executive and in boards, and moving on and making room for new voices. And we stay committed to looking for those courageous companies and executives who are willing to say, I want the system to work for the entire enterprise here. The principles are called the modern principles for sensible and effective executive pay. Pay hasn't changed in decades. It's time to pick up the pace of change.
Yeah, it's really interesting as you talk about the role of boards, because I think one of the pushbacks that we tend to hear when we're talking to companies about this is, oh, but the war for talent, if we are the ones who do something different and pay something that's not as much, say, to our CEO, how are we going to compete? We're not going to end up with the best CEO. And how do you respond to that concern? I hear, I think, a nugget of your response in what you said so far, but either one of you, I'd love to hear how you respond to that concern that boards and maybe some executives express.
I think a few years ago, I saw a poll. I think Stanford had done a poll where it asked different populations about how rare CEO talent was. And I believe corporate directors basically said there might be 2 or 3 people in the world who can run our firm well. Whereas, recruiters and even investors had very different views on that, right? That there were many more people who could run this firm pretty well. Certainly there's going to be an exceptional CEO, out there. But there still won't be a huge variation in performance from the vast majority of CEO caliber people. And so I think there is, I don't know how to solve this, but it's interesting to note the scarcity mindset that permeates boardrooms. And I think it's a good practice to question those things and frankly rethink how we're evaluating talent. Who even is entering the pipeline of kind of the future CEOs, and I think we will reveal a lot more talent out there that and so that I don't know if the talent is as scarce. I'm not in a position to really have an informed opinion on this, but I think it's worth revisiting that question and maybe breaking down or being more nuanced about the scarcity mindset.
Yeah, let me pile on to that if I could. Please. For 1 second. When Goldman Sachs proclaimed last year that they weren't going to take any company public that didn't have at least 1 woman on the board, and I think they said 1 person of color, 1 so-called diverse candidate or something along those lines, I remember thinking, talk about a low bar. People were praising this action, and I was kind of like scratching my head, going, "This is important because we are leaving so much talent out of the picture." And I think that's going to change. I think it's going to change quickly, and I think it's going to change, with much greater consciousness about the role of the CEO, the role of the board, and much greater consideration for all of the things that this network stands for. And so, pay needs to be at the center of that conversation to make sure that it in fact is really opening up the possibilities. So none of this is easy, but this is not about scarcity. This is about the potential for really even looking inside. I think there's a lot of research that says that the most successful CEOs are ones who came up through the ranks. And so the idea somehow that the CEO of GE is going to hop ship and go become the CEO of, I don't know, some other company, JP Morgan or something, that kind of change doesn't happen at those kinds of levels. We are talking about public companies. It is remarkably complex, these jobs, and we need people that have the right skill set. Without a question, these are complicated jobs and we need the right people in them. But I think the right people is a much bigger catchment than we've been giving it credit for.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to turn to some of the listener questions. We have some great ones here. Let me start with this one. If 90% of profit is being paid to shareholders, that seems to be the biggest cause of the imbalance. So how do we shift that so as to free a higher percentage to be paid fairly across the organization?
Well, there was a point in time in which share buybacks were viewed as being illegal, that was not, that was the ultimate conflict. I'll just make that editorial comment and turn it over to my colleague, Miguel, to respond.
I mean, I think there's a whole host of influences here. I mean, that's the end result of a long chain of nudges in our system that all focus executives on shareholder returns. And so there's no one solution. It's unwinding a bunch of them. And that could be, that goes as deep as rethinking how we tax capital gains and favor that to how we make our choices in boardrooms and in C-suites and that agency that people have. But this is an incredibly large and complicated knot that we've woven over the course of at least 4 decades. And no one thing is going to untie that knot. So there's, I think, an overall de-emphasis, not only normatively, perhaps through policy as well, on shareholder return as being a kind of goal of these massively important engines of our economy, these corporations, is really, really, really important. But it's a very complicated mix.
Yeah, and I'll just add my own editorial there, which is that I think we saw in COVID, we saw for the first time kind of the public getting a little bit outraged at buybacks, right? These companies that did big buybacks and then laid off workers suddenly were actually getting called out on that, I think during COVID more than in the past. So this may be a moment where we hopefully start to see some additional change. Next question. Isn't part of the problem an overemphasis on the CEO role? If servant leadership is a superior leadership model, doesn't that say the CEO role is less important and therefore doesn't need to be so disproportionately compensated?
I love that question.
Me too.
I actually write about it in the sense that I use the analogy that the compensation system treats every company as if it's an airline, and the only one who matters is the pilot. Not the grounds crew, not the people who welcome people on board or keep them safe, not the people that book the tickets. If there's anything that's complicated, it's company. And but it's all of the parts that make up the company that is where superior performance lies. And today we're gradually coming around to the view that employees are not just a cost of doing business. Employees, I call them, they're our greatest allies. And companies that we have done extraordinarily well over a long period of time. I mean, I use the example of Southwest Airlines, the company that Herb Kelleher built. I mean, he believed deeply in this principle that employees are at the center of his success, and made sure that, it was about making sure that life was interesting and fun for his employees as well as the customers, and it brought him to great success. I mean, Delta Airlines is another one. Coming out of bankruptcy, they kind of broke the system and said, to get these pilots smiling when they come to work again, who have taken big pay cuts, we're going to need to create a a profit sharing plan. But when they built it from the top to the bottom. And so everybody participates at the same percentage in the profit sharing plan at Delta. And that has literally been at the center of a company that was not very highly regarded, becoming the most regarded airline. And so, and with the best performance record in terms of on-time performance, that sort of thing. So I think the world's changed. I think we're listening differently to employees today. And boy, if we don't, look what happens, right? So we're seeing a lot of action happen in companies, you know, from Google to Amazon, where there's actually a call for creating new unions. And they will operate differently if they are created. And so, you know, I'd say watch the space. We need a different kind of CEO to manage well in this domain.
And I just add, I think this gets at understanding a different definition of talent. The talent exists throughout the organization, and it's not a superhero at the top and just cogs below. And I think that it's a wonderful question, and the point absolutely I agree with that this is really about a team and a culture more than a singular leader.
Next question, thoughts on the move to incorporate ESG targets into exec comp? And Miguel, I know you mentioned this earlier, but how do we balance the importance of kind of signaling change on things like carbon targets versus the potential to increase complexity? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, complicated. It's very, very complicated. If you are going to, I think at least you should not be piling on to what is already a huge pile of very discrete little targets with bits of money here, bits of money there. At least replace old targets that are less important, and don't keep piling on to the massive stack that's already there. I think the complexity is a real issue. I know the poll raised some interesting questions amongst the audience about whether simplicity is that important. I will say for the investor community, that's very important. I think if we're thinking about motivation, it's extremely important. Complex pay packages will not motivate. They just won't. It's not how incentives work psychologically. And so all it does is increases the cost of a pay package, and it actually creates more space for unethical or gaming behavior and these kinds of things that we certainly don't want. So, I think we need to be careful. There's a wonderful piece written years ago, an HBR piece. It's called Goals Gone Wild, and it's basically cautioning against over-prescribing goals and the hazards, and it's kind of treating goals and financial incentives more like prescription drugs. Like, they're powerful and they're useful for certain things, but let's not over-prescribe because they can be dangerous.
Judy, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think it reminds me of the conversation about metrics today. As if we're going to be able to come up with a simplistic set of metrics that everybody's going to buy into, and that they're going to provide comparisons between companies. I mean, every company's different, and it does start with purpose, and it does start with getting real clarity around, what has to be true to make sure that the operations of the enterprise are fully aligned with the intentions that are being set by the executive. And that's not easy to do. It's definitely a full court press, and it requires the entire agency of your employees. They're the ones that have their eyes on the risks, but also see the opportunities. And so it's a design question. How do we design pay to continue to be able to listen well in that domain? And of course, hire the right people.
Great, that's a good segue, I think, to the next question, which you took a principles-based approach because there are all these differences between companies, but this questioner wants to know, are there some specific hard and fast rules? So for example, should there be a specific ratio of worker to CEO pay? Peter Drucker said 20-1. What do you think?
Wouldn't that be nice? I think we could live with that. What do you think, Miguel?
Yeah.
The statistics, of course, are so crazy on this.
Yeah, it is. I don't have a hard and fast rule. I think that these are, by their nature, real questions of judgment. And frankly, I think we should get a little bit more comfortable with the language of morality when we're talking about pay. and because I think there's real human consequences to it. The exact same system that produces the inequality that we have, economic inequality, racial inequalities, and that exact same system produces these the current CEO pay outcomes that we have. And so this is complicated stuff. But I think we need to, look, if I was king for a day, I would probably have some hard and fast rules. But I don't think we're in a position to be able to really impose those on all companies and all industries. That's extremely difficult. I think we could potentially use tax policy if there's real political will behind it to maybe set a few kind of ceilings or whatever, if you will. But outside of that, it's a difficult one to legislate.
Yeah, and I'll also add, talking to a board member about this one time, she pointed out to me that you sometimes will see companies just engineer around it. So there was a company that had imposed some sort of pay ratio. So they fired all their employees and outsourced a bunch of the work because that helped them with the pay ratio. So there can be some unintended consequences that may go against the principle. So we need to wrap up now. So I just want to give Judy and Miguel a final chance for any concluding thoughts. My concluding thought is terrific questions, great audience, and really appreciate, Miguel and Judy, your perspectives. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Send cards and letters. Tell us what you're experimenting with. We're eager to continue this conversation. The people that are represented in this kind of network are creative. They have the right ends in mind. They understand the nuance. They are, they know it's not one size fits all. And I think it'd be a great environment in which we could see some real experimentation. And we'd love to learn about it if it's happening.
Yeah, I would just echo that. Try stuff, revisit your old assumptions, and experiment, and teach us some things, frankly, and definitely let us know so we can amplify it.
And of course, behind the simple slide we used is a not very complicated document, but it is a longer document that actually frames the actual questions that boards can use to dive into these principles. So we certainly encourage you to take a look at those as well.
Thank you so much. Amanda, back over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Miguel. Thank you, Judy, so much for joining us today. It was such a wonderful session. I so appreciate the interactivity and you taking time to answer so many questions, so many thoughtful questions from our community. To everyone attending, we did post a quick survey. If you could please just take a quick moment to answer that for us. It helps us to plan for future sessions. We're also going to be following up with all registrants today with both the recording as well as the principles, so you can revisit them and some links to what Aspen Institute has going on, including Judy's new book. So thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. We hope to see you next week. We're going to hear from Ed Freeman on stakeholder capitalism. Thank you so very much.
All right. Thank you,
all.
Amanda and Michelle.